The morning buzz of the terminal echoed with rolling suitcases, muffled boarding calls, and the shuffle of hurried footsteps. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow across polished tile floors, the kind that reflected faces back at passengers in ghostly fragments. It was just after 9 a.m., and most travelers were in their own worlds, checking flight times, tapping at phones, juggling coffee cups and carry-ons. Yet, within this routine hum of transit, something was about to snap into focus, pulling every pair of eyes in earshot toward one unfolding moment. Terrence Harris stood in line for the security checkpoint, his boarding pass clutched between his fingers. At 45, with a strong build and a quiet dignity in his posture, he blended in easily among the crowd of business travelers and vacationers. His neatly pressed gray slacks and crisp button-down shirt carried the effortless look of someone accustomed to public scrutiny but unconcerned with vanity. His dark brown skin caught the light as he turned slightly, scanning the slow-moving line with patient calm. Beside him, his wife, Monique, adjusted the strap of her purse, whispering something that drew a faint smile from him. They were headed to Washington, D.C., on what looked like any other routine trip. To strangers, they appeared like any married couple traveling together. But Terrence's silence, his sharp eyes, and his measured breathing suggested a man who carried far more weight than a simple itinerary. A uniformed officer approached from the side of the checkpoint. His presence alone seemed to carve open space in the crowded line. Jason Whitaker, a local police officer assigned to airport patrol, was tall, broad-shouldered, with a closely shaven head that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His boots struck the tile with deliberate heaviness as he zeroed in on Terrence. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes sharp with something more than professional alertness, something that simmered close to hostility. "Sir!" Whitaker barked, his voice slicing through the murmur of the terminal. Several passengers turned instinctively, startled by the harsh tone. "Step out of the line! Now!" Terrence raised an eyebrow, calm but unflinching. "Is there a problem, officer?" Whitaker's gaze hardened. "You heard me. Step out of line." Monique instinctively touched her husband's arm, her grip light but urgent. Around them, conversations died down. Strangers stopped mid-stride, luggage wheels stilled, and the hum of the terminal bent inward, focusing sharply on this single confrontation. Terrence shifted his weight slightly, neither confrontational nor submissive. "I'll comply," he said evenly, handing his boarding pass to Monique before stepping aside. His voice was steady, absent of the panic Whitaker perhaps expected or hoped for. The officer's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "What's in your bag?" Terrence glanced at the small leather briefcase at his feet. "Documents, reading material, a laptop, the usual." "Open it." The demand carried no hint of courtesy, no pretense of routine security procedure. A hush swept the line as eyes darted back and forth, passengers sensing something wrong but too wary to intervene. Terrence bent down, lifted the briefcase onto the inspection table and clicked it open. Inside lay a laptop, 2 neatly stacked folders, and a small leather notebook. Whitaker's gloved hand rummaged through the items with exaggerated slowness, each movement dripping with suspicion. He flipped through the folders, his eyes narrowing at the sight of official-looking documents. He wasn't reading them. He was searching for something, anything, that might justify his posture of authority. "You traveling for business?" Whitaker asked, his tone sharp, almost mocking. Terrence's voice remained calm. "Yes, business." Whitaker's eyes flicked toward Monique, then back to Terrence. "And what kind of business puts you above basic security checks?" Terrence tilted his head slightly. "I never said I was above them. You stopped me." The officer's nostrils flared. The passengers watching held their breath. A murmur rippled through the line, a whispered question, a hushed remark. Some pulled out their phones, not yet recording, but hovering, as though sensing that what was happening might soon demand evidence. Whitaker leaned closer, his voice dropping to a cutting hiss. "Men like you always think the rules don't apply, always think you can question authority." Terrence's eyes narrowed slightly. His silence was more powerful than any retort. He stood tall, his presence measured, refusing to flinch under the weight of the officer's hostility. Monique stepped forward, her voice steady but edged with quiet fire. "Officer, my husband has complied with everything you asked. There's no reason to single him out." Whitaker's gaze snapped to her, hard and unyielding. "Stay out of this, ma'am." A young TSA agent shifted uncomfortably a few feet away, caught between the rigid posture of law enforcement and the uneasy truth playing out before him. His training told him to defer to police, but his conscience whispered otherwise. Still, he said nothing. Terrence closed his briefcase slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. "Are we done here?" Whitaker's eyes flashed. "Not by a long shot. Step with me, sir, now." Gasps and whispers stirred in the crowd. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some instinctively pulling out their phones and lifting them subtly toward chest level. The tension was unmistakable. This was no longer routine. Terrence glanced at Monique, his expression calm but resolute. She gave the faintest nod, her eyes filled with worry but also something else, trust. Terrence turned back to Whitaker. "Lead the way." As they moved toward a quieter corner of the terminal, Whitaker's tone shifted from official to openly hostile. "You think you can just walk in here, act untouchable, and not answer to me? I don't care who you think you are." Terrence's reply was measured, each word deliberate. "You don't need to care who I am. You need to care about the truth." The words seemed to land heavier than expected. Whitaker stiffened, his jaw tightening as if the balance of control had suddenly shifted. Around them, the bystanders who had dared to follow at a distance began holding their phones higher now, recording openly. The faint red dots of camera lights blinked through the crowd. Whitaker's voice rose louder now, sharp enough to cut through the terminal chatter. "You so much as raise your voice and I'll put you in cuffs. Do you understand me?" Terrence met his glare with silence. His stillness was unsettling, an authority of its own. Monique's voice, low but unshakable, broke the tension. "Officer, you're making a mistake." For a moment, the entire terminal seemed suspended in time. The officer, the traveler, the crowd. Every breath, every step, every whisper revolved around the confrontation. And what no one in that space yet knew was that the man standing silently under the officer's threats, the man being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, was not just another passenger. He was Terrence Harris, United States Senator, chairman of the committee controlling Homeland Security funding, a man whose authority reached far beyond this terminal, a man whose silence would not last forever. The officer's grip on control was thin, and everyone could sense it. Jason Whitaker walked a step ahead of Terrence Harris, his boots striking the terminal floor with heavy, deliberate cadence. Each step seemed designed to echo authority, but the more he pressed, the more uneasy the crowd behind him became. Travelers who had been strangers only moments before were now bound by silent unity, holding up their phones, recording every movement. Terrence followed without protest, his stride calm, his expression unreadable. He carried no fear in his posture, only the quiet patience of a man who had weathered storms larger than one officer's hostility. Monique kept pace just behind, her eyes sharp, her voice low as she whispered to her husband, "Stay steady, he wants you to break." "I know," Terrence murmured, his gaze fixed forward, "but he doesn't realize he's already broken." Whitaker spun around at the words, his face darkening. "What did you say?" Terrence didn't flinch. "I said I'm complying, exactly as you asked." The officer's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring with the strain of keeping control. "Don't test me." They stopped near a cordoned-off corner of the checkpoint, an area meant for secondary inspection. A TSA supervisor, Danielle Morgan, approached hesitantly. In her navy blazer and TSA badge clipped neatly at her side, she looked professional but wary. Her eyes flicked between Terrence and Whitaker, sensing the imbalance. "Officer Whitaker," she began carefully, "what's the situation here?" Whitaker's response was sharp, rehearsed, and loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. This individual was acting suspicious, refused to answer questions directly, and may be in possession of restricted materials. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Terrence remained still, his face calm, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He didn't need to argue. His composure did the talking. Danielle frowned. "Sir, have you refused inspection?" "No," Terrence answered evenly. "I opened my briefcase when asked. Nothing more, nothing less." Whitaker cut in before Danielle could respond. "He's being evasive. Look at him, calm like he's above this. That's a red flag." The TSA supervisor's eyes narrowed. She had seen dozens of travelers every day, nervous, impatient, frustrated. But the man before her was different. There was no arrogance in his calmness, only control. Still, she couldn't outright challenge a police officer in front of a crowd. Her position hung on caution. "Officer," Danielle said slowly, "we'll handle the screening from here." Whitaker's eyes flashed. "No, this is my stop, my call. He's coming with me." The murmurs from the line behind them grew louder. Phones angled higher, recording in plain view now. One young traveler whispered audibly, "He didn't do anything. This is harassment." Another chimed in, "Someone call airport administration." Whitaker's face reddened as the tide of public scrutiny swelled. He turned to Terrence, his voice rising. "You so much as twitch, and you're in cuffs. Do you understand?" Terrence finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the officer. His voice was low, steady, and impossible to ignore. "Do what you think you must. But remember this moment, because so will I." The words hit like a stone dropped in still water, quiet, but sending ripples outward. Even Danielle Morgan stiffened at the gravity of them. The bystanders whispered louder now, sensing a story bigger than what they were seeing. Whitaker tried to regain his footing. "Empty your pockets. Everything now." Terrence complied without hesitation. Keys, wallet, boarding stub. Each item placed neatly on the table. There was no resistance, no hesitation, nothing to fuel the officer's growing desperation. When the officer found nothing suspicious, his frustration boiled over. He leaned in close, his voice sharp enough for nearby phones to capture clearly. "Men like you think you can walk around like you own this place. But let me remind you, you don't. Not here. Not under my watch." A collective intake of breath swept the crowd. His words, dripping with contempt, were no longer veiled. The racism was laid bare in front of dozens of witnesses. Monique's voice cut through the silence. Strong, clear. "Officer, enough." She stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You've searched his bag, his pockets, his belongings. You've humiliated him in front of everyone here. And you've found nothing. This ends now." Whitaker turned on her, pointing a finger sharply. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be detained as well." The crowd erupted into loud whispers. Several travelers called out, voices rising with indignation. "She hasn't done anything," one shouted. Another added, "We're recording this every second." The TSA supervisor, caught in the eye of the storm, finally spoke with authority. "Officer Whitaker, we need to de-escalate." But Whitaker was beyond reason. His voice thundered above the noise. "De-escalate? You don't know what this man is capable of." Terrence's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed calm. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." And for the first time, Whitaker faltered. His bluster collided with something unshakable in Terrence's tone. Something that hinted at a truth bigger than anyone in the terminal yet realized. Behind the crowd, another figure approached, a man in a dark suit, earpiece tucked neatly in place. Brett Morgan, airport security director, strode forward with urgency. His presence was quiet but commanding, his eyes scanning the situation with practiced precision. "Officer Whitaker," Brett said firmly, "what exactly is going on here?" The officer straightened quickly, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Suspicious traveler, uncooperative, refusing to answer questions." Brett's eyes shifted to Terrence, assessing him quickly. Something about his calm posture, his silence under pressure, triggered a flicker of recognition. But before he could place it, Whitaker pressed on. "He needs to be detained for questioning." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Several passengers spoke out now, emboldened by numbers. "He didn't do anything! This is racial profiling! We saw everything!" Brett raised his hand, silencing the noise. His voice was even, measured. "I'll take it from here." Whitaker bristled. "Director, with respect." "With respect," Brett interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut through. "You've turned this checkpoint into chaos. Step aside." For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Authority against authority. Finally, Whitaker stepped back, his fists clenched tight, his jaw rigid with barely contained rage. Terrence exhaled softly, turning toward Brett. "Thank you." Brett studied him closely now. His eyes flicked to the document still partially visible in the briefcase. He caught a glimpse of an embossed seal, official, unmistakable. His brow furrowed, realization dawning. "Sir?" Brett said carefully, his voice lowering. "Do you hold public office?" Terrence's silence was deliberate. He didn't answer directly, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The crowd leaned in, the tension electric. The officer's authority was crumbling, and yet no one knew just how completely it was about to collapse. Whitaker, sensing control slipping beyond recovery, snarled. "You think you're somebody important? You think this changes anything?" Terrence's gaze finally settled on him, his voice calm but cutting with precision. "Yes, it changes everything." And though the officer didn't yet know it, the truth of those words would reverberate far beyond the walls of that airport. The silence that followed Terrence Harris's last words was heavier than the roar of jet engines outside the terminal windows. Passengers stood frozen, their phones still raised, eyes flicking between the composed traveler and the officer whose authority seemed to dissolve with each passing second. Jason Whitaker's chest rose and fell rapidly, his uniform damp with sweat, his anger scraping against the edges of fear. He wasn't just dealing with a passenger anymore. He could feel it, though he didn't understand why. Something about Terrence's tone, his posture, the quiet certainty in his words, unnerved him. It was the same unease that comes when a man realizes too late that he has chosen the wrong opponent. Brett Morgan, the airport security director, kept his gaze on Terrence, his mind working quickly. He had been in this job long enough to know when someone carried weight far beyond a boarding pass and a carry-on. The embossed seal on those documents wasn't decoration. It was authority. Real, formidable authority. "Sir," Brett said, his voice low but steady, "I need to verify your credentials, privately." Terrence's eyes flicked to Monique, then back to Brett. With a measured nod, he closed the briefcase and lifted it with calm assurance. "Lead the way." The crowd erupted in chatter as Brett escorted Terrence and Monique toward a glass-walled conference room adjacent to the checkpoint. Phones were still recording, voices whispering, speculation running wild. "Did you hear him?" someone said. "He's important." Another added, "That cop's in big trouble, you can feel it." Whitaker stayed rooted where he stood, rage and confusion twisting across his face. His authority had been seized from him in front of an audience, and every instinct screamed to fight for it back. But for the first time that morning, he hesitated. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter of the terminal was muted, replaced by the hum of air vents and the faint click of the door locking behind them. Brett gestured toward the table. "Please, sit." Terrence placed the briefcase down carefully, opening it without flourish. He slid one folder forward. Brett's eyes widened as he read the header. United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting Terrence's steady eyes. "You're—" Terrence cut him off gently. "Yes, I am Senator Terrence Harris, chairman of the subcommittee that oversees Homeland Security funding." The words landed with the force of a gavel. Monique sat silently beside her husband, her composure unshaken, though her eyes carried the weight of a woman who had witnessed her partner face battles like this before. Brett leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This changes everything." Terrence's response was quiet, almost a whisper. "No, Director. It only reveals what was already true." The implications swirled instantly in Brett's mind. Funding, oversight, accountability. The man who had just been threatened, humiliated, and accused without cause was the very one who held sway over billions in Homeland Security appropriations. And it had all unfolded in public view, captured on dozens of cell phone cameras. Monique spoke for the first time since entering the room. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge that silenced the air. "This isn't about my husband being a senator. It's about a man in uniform who abused his power because of the color of his skin. That should terrify all of us." Brett nodded slowly, the truth of her words undeniable. He turned back to Terrence. "Senator, I'll file an incident report immediately. Internal review, escalation to federal oversight, whatever you request." Terrence closed the briefcase, his hand steady on the latch. "There will be time for reports. What matters now is how this moment unfolds. Every camera out there is still recording. Every traveler who watched is already telling the story. The narrative is moving, and it won't wait for paperwork." Brett understood. This wasn't going to be contained. It was already too big. Meanwhile, outside the room, Jason Whitaker paced like a caged animal. His fellow officers, who had once stood behind him, were now exchanging uneasy glances, their confidence eroding under the weight of what they'd just witnessed. One whispered, "If that man's who I think he is..." Whitaker's finished. Passengers lingered, unwilling to move on. The energy in the terminal had shifted from curiosity to indignation. What had started as one man's humiliation was now a collective demand for accountability. Back inside, Terrence rose from his seat, his height and composure commanding. "Director Morgan, I'm boarding that flight. You will ensure there are no further interruptions." "Yes, Senator," Brett said firmly, already reaching for his radio. "And," Terrence added, his voice cool but resolute, "Officer Whitaker will not lay another hand on any traveler until a full review is complete." The director's nod was immediate. Understood. As Terrence and Monique stepped out of the conference room, the noise of the terminal surged back around them. All eyes turned, phones raised higher. The officer who had tried to strip him of dignity now stood pale and trembling, watching his authority crumble in real time. Terrence walked past him without a glance, his silence more damning than any words could be. Monique followed close, her chin lifted, her presence as commanding as his. For Whitaker, the moment was suffocating. He had thought himself untouchable, armed with a badge and arrogance. But as the senator walked away, the truth bore down on him with crushing weight. He had not just threatened a traveler. He had threatened the man who could decide the future of his department's funding, his training, his very career. And though the crowd didn't yet know every detail, they knew enough. The story was already alive, and it would grow louder with each retelling. What began as an abuse of authority in an airport checkpoint was about to erupt into a national reckoning. By the time Terrence Harris and his wife Monique reached their gate, the terminal had transformed into something closer to a press conference than a travel hub. Strangers were clustered in groups, speaking in hushed but urgent tones, replaying video clips on their phones, pointing toward the checkpoint where the confrontation had taken place. Every angle had been captured. The officer's harsh commands, Terrence's calm defiance, Monique's sharp rebuke. And every word had already begun its migration, from private whispers to public posts to national attention. A college student at the gate refreshed her feed, gasping softly. "It's already trending. Airport incident, Senator?" A middle-aged businessman shook his head as he replayed the clip. "That officer's finished. Look at this. He told him men like you with cameras rolling. He's done." Monique listened without reaction, her face composed. She leaned toward her husband, her voice low and steady. "They don't know the half of it yet." Terrence's response was calm, almost weary. "They will." Meanwhile, Officer Jason Whitaker stood near the security station, flanked by two of his own colleagues. The badge on his chest felt heavier than armor, but far less protective. His fellow officers avoided his eyes, their silence louder than any condemnation. The crowd's whispers, the passengers' raised phones, the TSA supervisor's unease, all of it painted him not as protector but aggressor. Brett Morgan, the airport security director, approached Whitaker with deliberate slowness. "You're relieved of duty pending review. Hand over your badge and weapon." The officer's face twisted, caught between disbelief and fury. "You can't do this." "I just did," Brett said firmly. "This is bigger than you realize, and right now, your presence is a liability." The badge was surrendered, the holster unbuckled. For the first time that morning, Jason Whitaker felt naked, not in body, but in authority. News traveled faster than flights. By the time Terrence and Monique boarded their plane, the first national outlets were already running headlines. "Airport confrontation, officer threatens traveler who turns out to be U.S. Senator." Clips of the incident were spliced together. The phrase, "men like you," replayed endlessly across social feeds. On the plane, Terrence sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the tarmac below. Monique rested her hand lightly on his, her voice quiet but firm. "This is going to be war." He turned to her, his eyes calm, resolute. "War has rules. This is different. This is exposure." By the time their plane landed in Washington, D.C., the fire had spread unchecked. Reporters swarmed the arrivals terminal, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Shouted questions filled the air. "Senator Harris, do you plan to press charges? Did the officer know who you were? Is this incident going to affect Homeland Security funding negotiations?" Terrence lifted a hand for silence, his voice carrying with the weight of a man accustomed to command. "What happened yesterday was not about me as a senator. It was about me as an American citizen, a man stopped, harassed, and threatened for nothing more than existing in the wrong eyes. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and that is the problem." The crowd of reporters erupted, their pens scratching, cameras whirring. His words were not the angry retort of a humiliated man, but the calm declaration of someone who had chosen the battlefield. Back in the city, the ripple turned tidal. Editorials flooded newspapers. Evening anchors raised eyebrows as they recounted the footage, the officer's words, the senator's silence. Civil rights groups amplified the incident as a case study in systemic abuse. Political analysts speculated on the fallout, connecting dots between airport security, federal oversight, and Senate hearings already looming on the horizon. In a small office hundreds of miles away, Jason Whitaker sat hunched over his desk, his badge now a memory, his phone vibrating with messages he didn't dare open. News anchors were saying his name, strangers were combing through his record, old complaints whispered into light. His career, once shielded by silence and camaraderie, was now dragged into daylight. His reflection in the darkened window looked back at him with hollow eyes. He muttered under his breath, clenching his fists. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But the truth was merciless. The man he thought was just another traveler had been the one person he could never afford to target. And now, that truth was a headline. In Washington, Terrence Harris prepared for what came next. His office phones rang nonstop, aides whispering updates about committee members, media requests, and security briefings. Yet through the noise, Terrence remained steady, his calm presence unnerving even his own staff. Danielle Morgan, the TSA supervisor who had witnessed the entire incident, received a formal request for testimony. Her words would carry weight. She had seen the officer escalate. She had watched Terrence comply. She had heard the words that betrayed bias. For the first time in her career, her duty was not to protocol but to truth. Monique sat with her husband that evening, their home a temporary fortress against the storm. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but unwavering. "You've faced worse. This is just another battlefield." Terrence nodded slowly. "Yes, but this one isn't fought in shadows. It's fought in the open. And everyone is watching." The next morning, the Senate chamber buzzed with unusual tension. Staffers whispered about the incident, their words flitting like sparks in dry grass. Cameras lined the hallways, waiting for the senator's arrival. When Terrence stepped inside, the murmur fell quiet. His presence was steady, his expression unreadable. He walked with the same calm authority he had shown at the airport, unshaken, unyielding. The chairman's gavel struck wood, calling the committee to order. "This hearing will address oversight of federal security operations," the voice declared. "Senator Harris, you may begin." And in that moment, the airport confrontation transformed. No longer a single officer's abuse, it became evidence. No longer a humiliation, it became testimony. No longer an isolated incident, it became a weapon against a system long shielded from accountability. Whitaker, watching from afar, could feel it. His arrogance, once armor, now felt like shackles. He had not just confronted a traveler, he had sparked a fire that would burn through his own career and possibly much more. For Terrence Harris, the path forward was clear. He had endured the humiliation, revealed the truth, and carried it into the heart of power, and he would not stop until accountability was no longer optional, but inevitable. The man who had been threatened at an airport was now the man who would decide what security meant for every airport in America. And the officer who thought himself untouchable had just learned what it meant to stand against the wrong man at the wrong time. The marble walls of the Senate hearing chamber reflected the weight of history. Rows of polished wood desks stretched out beneath chandeliers that cast a cold, steady light. Cameras lined the back of the room, their lenses unblinking, waiting to broadcast every word beyond the chamber's walls. What had begun as a confrontation in an airport terminal had now reached the heart of government. Senator Terrence Harris sat at the center, his posture composed, his hands folded neatly before him. Around him, colleagues whispered, aides shuffled papers, and journalists filled the gallery. Across the nation, millions tuned in to watch, some out of outrage, others out of curiosity. But all were waiting to see what the man at the center of the storm would say. The chairman's gavel struck. This hearing of the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs will come to order. Today's agenda includes oversight of federal security operations and the recent incident involving Senator Harris. The chamber hushed. Every eye turned toward Terrence. He began without notes, his voice steady, deliberate. 2 weeks ago, I was traveling through a public airport, as any citizen might. I complied with security procedures, carried nothing prohibited, and offered no resistance. And yet, I was stopped, singled out, accused, and threatened by an officer who saw not a traveler, not a senator, but a target, a man to control, a man to humiliate. The words hung in the chamber, heavy and undeniable. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras whirred, and even his fellow senators shifted uneasily. Terrence continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "What happened to me is not extraordinary. It is ordinary. That is the tragedy. For every video that surfaces, countless others go unseen. For every senator who can stand here and recount it, there are thousands of Americans who cannot. And that is why we are here." He paused, his silence commanding the room as effectively as any speech. Then, with measured clarity, he shifted. "This committee controls funding for our nation's security apparatus, billions of dollars every year. Those dollars are supposed to buy safety, accountability, and professionalism. Instead, too often they have purchased silence, misconduct, and impunity." The murmurs from the gallery grew louder, restrained only by the chairman's gavel. Terrence's eyes hardened. "That ends now. Not because I was targeted, but because I refuse to allow my silence to make me complicit. Security without accountability is not protection, it is oppression, and I will not fund oppression." The chamber erupted in whispers. Some senators frowned, others nodded gravely, but no one could deny the power of his words. Meanwhile, in a government office hundreds of miles away, Jason Whitaker sat alone at a metal table, the fluorescent lights above him buzzing faintly. He had been called to internal review, his every action dissected, his every word replayed. Complaints from years past, once buried, once dismissed, were now on the table. Across from him sat investigators, their files thick with records. "Officer Whitaker," one asked coolly, "do you deny telling Senator Harris, and I quote, 'Men like you don't get to question me'?" Jason's voice cracked as he stammered, It was taken out of context. Context? The investigator interrupted sharply. The context is that you abused your authority in public, in violation of every principle of law enforcement. And you did it to a sitting senator. Jason's hands trembled as he clenched them together. His career, once untouchable, now crumbled in real time. Back in Washington, the hearing pressed forward. Testimony came from Danielle Morgan, the TSA supervisor. Her voice was calm but resolute. The senator complied with every directive. At no point did he resist. The officer escalated without cause. Other witnesses followed, passengers who had recorded the incident, experts on racial profiling, former officers who spoke candidly about systemic failures. Piece by piece, the narrative was no longer an isolated event. It was a mirror held up to the nation. Terrence listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt the momentum building. What had started as humiliation was becoming transformation. When his turn came again, he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chamber. We will introduce legislation requiring independent oversight at every major transportation hub. We will mandate body cameras for all airport patrol officers. And we will tie federal funding to compliance with strict accountability measures. If departments refuse, they will not receive $1. This is not optional. This is justice. The words detonated like thunder. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail. The set of his jaw, the steel in his eyes, the unflinching calm of a man who had endured and emerged stronger. Outside the chamber, protests swelled. Crowds gathered with signs reading, "Accountability now," and "Dignity for all travelers." Civil rights leaders praised the senator's stand while pundits debated the political cost. But for the people in the streets, it was simpler. A man in power had spoken the truth they had lived. Jason Whitaker, now suspended indefinitely, watched the coverage from his living room. His name was a headline, his face plastered across screens, his reputation shredded. Former allies distanced themselves, his calls went unanswered, and his career ended before his own eyes. He muttered bitterly to the empty room. All this over one man. But even he knew it wasn't one man. It was the system he had trusted to protect him, now turned against him because his arrogance had exposed its cracks. Weeks later, the committee passed its reforms. Funding was redirected, oversight established, and accountability sharpened. Departments scrambled to adapt, officers grumbled about new rules, but the message was clear: unchecked authority would no longer be bankrolled without question. For Terrence Harris, it was not victory, but responsibility. He returned to his office late one evening, the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. Monique waited for him, her presence a quiet anchor. "You did it," she said softly. Terrence shook his head. "We started it. Justice isn't a destination, it's a fight, and it never ends." Monique stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his. "Then we'll keep fighting. Together." He looked at her, his eyes steady, his voice firm. "Always." And with that, the man who had been threatened in an airport, reduced to nothing more than a traveler in one officer's eyes, had transformed that moment into a turning point for a nation. Because sometimes the most powerful statement is not shouted in anger but spoken calmly with the weight of truth behind it. And sometimes a single confrontation is enough to force an entire country to look at itself. The sun had barely risen when Jason Whitaker's phone began buzzing with relentless ferocity. It wasn't colleagues checking in or friends offering support. It was silence broken only by missed calls from reporters, notifications from social media accounts he had never heard of, and messages that all said the same thing: "You've been exposed." He sat at his kitchen table, the badge that once symbolized authority now lying in the center like a relic. The silence of the room pressed down on him, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the heavy thud of his own heartbeat. Whitaker's wife, Lauren, hovered near the counter, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her voice, once gentle, was now sharp with disbelief. "Jason, what were you thinking? They're saying you targeted a senator. Do you realize what that means?" He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the badge. "I didn't know who he was. To me, he was just another mouthy passenger. Lauren's eyes narrowed, tears brimming. That's the problem. You didn't see him as a person at all. Jason turned away, his jaw tightening. The walls of his home felt smaller than ever, closing in on a man who had once carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. Now, he was cornered, exposed. Across the country, the storm only grew. Morning talk shows dissected every frame of the video. Analysts replayed the moment he said, "Men like you," looping it again and again as a symbol of arrogance and bias. Editorials filled newspapers, some calling for his firing, others demanding sweeping reform. Even late-night comedians had turned him into a punchline, mocking the officer who picked the wrong traveler to harass. But not everyone was on Terrence Harris's side. In the Capitol, certain senators grumbled behind closed doors, their voices tight with calculation. "Harris is grandstanding," one muttered. "He's weaponizing this to push his agenda." Another leaned forward, whispering, "If he ties funding to accountability, half our donors will revolt. We need to push back. Hard." Opposition was forming, quiet but deliberate. What had started as a personal confrontation was now political ammunition. In his office, Terrence sat with his senior aide, Darnell Freeman, a man he had trusted for over a decade. Darnell was tall, with the kind of presence that filled a room even when he spoke softly. He leaned against the desk, his arms folded, his eyes sharp with focus. "You shook the ground, Senator," Darnell said, his tone half warning, half admiration. "But ground that shakes can open fissures. You've got enemies circling." Terrence leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "Let them circle. They can't erase the truth." Darnell stepped closer, his voice dropping. "They don't have to erase it. They just have to drown it. Smear campaigns, leaked stories, anything to make this about you instead of the system." Terrence studied him, his silence heavy. Finally, he spoke. "Then we don't give them silence. We give them clarity. Every word, every reform, every action. We shine so much light they can't stand in it." Darnell's lips curled into the faintest smile. "That's the senator I know." Meanwhile, Jason Whitaker's union held an emergency meeting in a dimly lit conference room. The air was thick with smoke and anger. Men in uniform sat around the table, their voices low but bristling with frustration. "If Harris gets his way, they'll hang us out to dry," one officer said, slamming his palm against the table. Another leaned in, eyes darting around the room. "We need to get ahead of this. Frame it as overreach. Say he's using one incident to strip every officer of authority." Jason sat in the corner, his face pale, his hands trembling. He wanted to believe his brothers in uniform still stood behind him, but he could feel the cracks, whispers about his past complaints, questions about his judgment, doubts about whether he was worth defending. As the meeting dragged on, Jason realized the truth. He was no longer their comrade. He was their liability. Back in Washington, Terrence and Monique sat together in the quiet of their home. The fire from the hearth flickered across their faces, casting long shadows on the walls. Monique reached for his hand, her voice low. "They're coming for you." Terrence's eyes met hers, calm but resolute. "Let them come. I've faced worse. This time the battlefield is here, and I won't back down." The night stretched long, but one truth was already clear. The confrontation at the airport had only been the beginning. The real fight was just beginning to take shape. The glow of the Capitol dome lit the Washington night sky like a beacon, but inside the halls of power, shadows stirred. Senators and representatives filed in and out of meetings, their conversations clipped and guarded, their alliances shifting with every headline. The Harris Airport incident had reshaped the political landscape in a way no one had expected. Terrence Harris's proposal to tie federal Homeland Security funding to accountability reforms was simple in language but seismic in impact. Overnight, it had drawn lines between allies and adversaries. Civil rights groups and watchdog organizations cheered the measure, calling it historic. Police unions and entrenched lawmakers, however, treated it as an existential threat. In one wood-paneled office, the opposition gathered. A half-dozen senators sat around a polished table, the air heavy with tension. Rachel Morris, a senior lawmaker with decades of experience maneuvering behind the scenes, leaned forward, her voice calm but cutting. If Harris gets this through, every local department in the country will answer to Washington. Our donors won't tolerate it. We need to frame this for what it is, federal overreach. Another senator, Ethan Riley, nodded sharply. And we hammer on the fact that Harris used his own incident to push policy, make it about personal revenge, not public reform. The group murmured agreement, their strategy forming like storm clouds over the city. But outside those closed doors, the public tide was harder to contain. Clips of the airport confrontation flooded television screens, hashtags dominated social media, and protesters gathered daily outside the Capitol with signs reading, "Dignity for all travelers," and "Accountability now." Every attempt to paint Harris as self-serving was met with images of him standing calm while an officer threatened him in front of dozens of witnesses. In his Senate office, Terrence sat at his desk, flanked by Darnell Freeman and Monique. Papers covered the table, drafts of legislation, copies of testimony, notes from constituents. Darnell paced, his voice filled with urgency. "They're throwing everything at you. Smear pieces in the papers, leaks about your old votes, whispers about your motives. They're trying to drown you in noise." Terrence leaned back, his voice calm, almost serene. "Noise fades. Truth doesn't." Monique placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "But noise can distract. Stay sharp. They want you angry. They want you reckless. Don't give it to them." Her words settled over the room, grounding him. He nodded slowly. "Then we stay disciplined, step by step, just like any campaign, just like any mission." Meanwhile, Jason Whitaker's world collapsed further. The internal investigation dug deep, pulling files from his entire career. Complaints he thought buried resurfaced: excessive force, racial bias, unnecessary escalations. Once, his union had shielded him. Now, under the weight of national scrutiny, they distanced themselves. Jason sat in a sterile conference room, an investigator sliding documents across the table. 3 separate complaints in 5 years, the man said flatly, each dismissed without action. "Do you deny these occurred?" Jason's face burned red. They were lies, angry suspects making things up. The investigator's eyes were cold. "And now? Is the senator lying too?" The silence that followed was damning. At night, Jason drank alone, the television flashing with images of Terrence Harris speaking to crowds, his voice calm, his presence commanding. Jason hurled a glass across the room, shattering it against the wall. "He ruined me," he muttered. "One man ruined me." But deep down, he knew it wasn't one man. It was his own arrogance, his own abuse of power, finally caught in the light. Back in Washington, hearings stretched long into the night. Lobbyists leaned on lawmakers, unions funneled money into campaigns, and headlines shifted with every leak. Yet through it all, Terrence remained steady. When his turn came to speak again, he leaned into the microphone, his voice clear. "This is not about punishing officers. It is about protecting citizens. It is about ensuring that every badge represents service, not control. If departments meet that standard, they will have nothing to fear. If they don't, then they will not be funded with taxpayer dollars. It is that simple." The gallery erupted in murmurs. The cameras zoomed in, and across the nation, millions watched. His opponents whispered and plotted, but the truth was undeniable. Terrence Harris had turned a personal humiliation into a national debate. And though the battle was far from over, the tide was shifting. Whitaker's name was already a symbol, not of authority, but of disgrace. And Terrence's was becoming something more. A reminder that silence, when broken with truth, can shake the foundations of power. The morning newspapers arrived on doorsteps across the nation with bold, accusatory headlines. "Senator exploits incident for power play." "Is Harris using office for revenge?" "Homeland Security reforms spark division." In Washington coffee shops, commuters read the headlines aloud, debating in hushed tones. On television, pundits clashed fiercely. One side insisted Harris was finally forcing long overdue accountability. The other painted him as dangerous, claiming his proposals would tie the hands of law enforcement and leave the nation exposed. The campaign against him was coordinated, deliberate. Political operatives whispered to journalists, opposition researchers dug into old votes, and anonymous sources claimed Harris had once voted against funding bills that were now reframed as anti-security. The smear machine churned day and night. In his office, Terrence sat calmly, watching the coverage with Darnell Freeman at his side. Darnell's fists clenched as he listened to commentators twist the narrative. "They're turning you into the villain," he muttered. "One officer's abuse, and now they're trying to bury you instead of the problem." Terrence's voice was steady. "Let them talk. Noise fades. The truth is still the truth." Darnell paced, his voice sharper now. "But the noise is loud, and it's getting louder every day." Monique entered quietly, setting down a tray with 3 mugs of coffee. She looked at her husband, her expression both proud and worried. "You can't outshout them," she said softly. "But you don't need to. You just need to outlast them." Terrence took the mug, his gaze fixed on the television. "Exactly. Endurance wins battles." But outside the office, the smear campaign was gaining traction. Protesters appeared on both sides of the debate, some carrying signs in support of Harris, others waving banners declaring, "Stop politicizing security." The streets around the Capitol filled daily, the air thick with chants, the city itself becoming an echo chamber of division. Meanwhile, Jason Whitaker's world collapsed further. What had begun as suspension now escalated into federal scrutiny. Investigators traced patterns in his record, repeated complaints, questionable arrests, discrepancies in reports. The kind of details once dismissed as minor now became threads in a damning tapestry. Jason sat in an interrogation room, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mocking his silence. A federal investigator slid photographs across the table, images from the airport, frozen frames of his face twisted in anger, his hand gripping Terrence's arm. "You said the senator resisted," the investigator said flatly. "Does this look like resistance to you?" Jason's mouth went dry. He stared at the photographs, the damning clarity of the images stripping away every excuse he had rehearsed. "Officer Whitaker," the investigator pressed, "this isn't just misconduct, this is perjury. You lied in official reports. That carries weight, heavy weight." Jason clenched his fists under the table. His voice cracked as he muttered, "I was doing my job." The investigator leaned forward, his tone cold. "Your job isn't to lie. Your job isn't to abuse power. And now, your job may cost you your freedom." Jason looked away, his chest tightening, the reality pressing in like a vice. His career wasn't just ending. His life, as he had built it, was unraveling. Back in the Capitol, hearings grew more combative. Opponents questioned Terrence aggressively, their words sharp, designed to provoke. "Senator Harris," one demanded, "are you pushing this reform because of a personal grievance?" Terrence's reply was calm, unwavering. "No. I am pushing it because my personal grievance is shared by millions of Americans who cannot sit in this chair to speak for themselves. If my experience can amplify theirs, then it is my duty to do so." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Cameras zoomed closer. Across the nation, viewers leaned forward in living rooms, bars, and airports, their eyes fixed on the man who had turned humiliation into testimony. That night, in their quiet home, Monique sat across from her husband at the kitchen table. She studied him carefully, her voice low. "You've carried this weight with calm, but you're still human. Are you all right?" Terrence looked at her, his eyes softening briefly. "I'm tired," he admitted. "But tired isn't broken. Tired means we're still in the fight." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we keep fighting." Together, in another corner of the city, opposition leaders gathered again. Rachel Morris's voice was sharp, her words deliberate. "He's not breaking. Smears aren't working. We need something more." Ethan Riley leaned in, his tone conspiratorial. Then we question his integrity. We push harder. If he doesn't bend, we try to break him. But even as they plotted, Terrence's resilience grew. Every attempt to paint him as self-serving was countered by the calm composure he carried in public. His strength was not in shouting louder, but in standing steady, unflinching, while the storm raged around him. Jason, alone in his small house, turned on the television. The screen filled with Terrence's face, calm, resolute, commanding. Jason hurled the remote across the room, his voice breaking into a bitter shout. "You think you've won? This isn't over." But deep down he knew it was. The system he had trusted to shield him had finally turned against him, and the man he thought was just another traveler was dismantling everything he represented. The storm was far from passing, but its direction was clear, and Jason Whittaker was standing directly in its path. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, its walls lined with flags and the seal of the United States. Jason Whittaker sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his once sharp uniform replaced by a plain suit that fit poorly. Cameras outside had captured his arrival, flashes igniting as reporters shouted questions. Inside, silence pressed down on him. The prosecutor rose, his voice clear. "The state charges Officer Jason Whittaker with misconduct, falsifying official reports, and perjury. We will show a pattern of abuse, a history of complaints ignored, and the moment his lies collapsed when exposed by video and testimony." Jason shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He had told himself the senator had ruined him. But as the evidence unfolded, video of his words at the airport, witness statements, prior complaints, the truth was merciless. He had ruined himself. Back in Washington, the Capitol hummed with anticipation. The reform bill that Senator Terrence Harris had championed was reaching the floor. Staffers rushed through corridors, reporters filled the galleries, and protesters lined the steps outside. Some carried signs with Harris's name and the word justice. Others waved banners reading "Protect Law Enforcement." The divide was sharp, but the moment was historic. Inside his office, Terrence reviewed his notes with Darnell Freeman at his side. Darnell's voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the weight of the moment. "They'll come at you hard today. They've saved their worst for last. Smears, half-truths, anything to sway the vote." Terrence closed the folder, his voice calm. "Then let them. If I stand steady, the truth speaks for itself." Monique entered, quietly, her presence grounding him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't just about policy anymore. It's about legacy. They'll remember today." Terrence looked up at her, his eyes steady. "Then let them remember it for the right reason." The Senate chamber filled, the weight of the occasion settling over every seat. The opposition struck first. Rachel Morris's voice rang across the room, sharp and deliberate. "Colleagues, do not be fooled. This bill is not about reform. It is about one man's humiliation turned into political theater. Senator Harris seeks to use a personal incident to remake federal security policy. We cannot allow emotion to dictate law." The gallery stirred. Cameras zoomed in. For a moment the words seemed to hang heavy. Terrence rose slowly, adjusting his jacket. His voice carried calm authority. "This is not about humiliation. This is about accountability. What happened to me at an airport happens every day to Americans, without cameras, without witnesses, without the chance to sit here and speak. If my incident illuminated that reality, then it was not humiliation, it was revelation." The chamber fell silent. Even his opponents shifted uncomfortably, the force of his words cutting through rehearsed arguments. Outside the chamber, the media frenzy built. Headlines shifted in real time. Harris defends reform as revelation, not revenge. Commentators replayed his words, dissecting every syllable. The storm that had once threatened to drown him now seemed to propel him forward. Meanwhile, Jason Whitaker faced his own storm. Witness after witness testified against him. Danielle Morgan, the TSA supervisor, spoke with calm authority. The senator complied. The officer escalated. He abused his position. Passengers from the airport recalled the moment vividly. He singled the man out for no reason. We all saw it. Jason's attorney objected, argued, tried to frame him as misunderstood. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Jason sat silent, his eyes hollow, as the case he once thought he could control slipped beyond his grasp. Back in Washington, the decisive moment approached. The reform bill was called to a vote. Senators cast their choices, the electronic board lighting up with green and red. Each name called was another step toward history. Terrence sat, his expression unreadable, as the final votes tallied. The board froze, the result clear. The bill had passed. Applause erupted in the chamber, restrained at first, then growing. Reporters rushed to file stories. Protesters outside erupted in cheers or shouts of anger. The nation had shifted, one vote at a time. Terrence exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Darnell clasped his shoulder firmly. "You did it." Terrence shook his head. "We started it. The work comes next." That evening, in the quiet of his office, Terrence sat with Monique. The city outside was alive with reaction, but inside the world seemed still. Monique leaned closer, her voice soft. "They tried to break you, and you didn't bend." Terrence looked at her, his eyes steady. "I didn't bend because I wasn't standing alone." At the same hour, Jason Whitaker sat in his small kitchen, the verdict from his preliminary hearing echoing in his mind. Indictment. Trial pending. His union silent, his colleagues distant, his name ruined. He stared at the badge he had once worn proudly, now stripped of meaning. For the first time, he saw it not as a shield, but as a mirror reflecting everything he had squandered. The nation had chosen its path. Reform had triumphed, and the man who once wielded a badge like a weapon was left facing judgment he could not escape. The trial of Jason Whitaker stretched for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of misconduct. Former colleagues testified reluctantly, recounting incidents they had once ignored. Community members described encounters that had never made headlines. One by one, the pieces fit together into a portrait of a man who had hidden behind a badge and used it as armor for arrogance. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of misconduct, falsification of records, and perjury." Jason's face collapsed inward, his once confident posture gone. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict alone was enough. His career was not only over, it was disgraced. His name, once accompanied by the word officer, was now bound forever to the word guilty. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters announced the outcome. Some focused on the fall of a single man. Others tied it back to the larger story, the airport confrontation that had started it all, and the senator who had turned humiliation into reform. Back in Washington, Senator Terrence Harris sat at his desk, the Capitol dome glowing beyond his office window. The reform bill had not only passed, it had already begun reshaping the landscape. Independent oversight boards were being established at major airports. Body cameras were mandated for patrol officers. Federal funding was tied to compliance, and departments were scrambling to meet new standards. For travelers, it meant something intangible but vital: dignity. The quiet assurance that power, when exercised, would be watched, measured, and held accountable. Terrence knew it was only a first step. The system was vast, and resistance was still strong, But the precedent had been set. A single incident had forced a nation to look harder at the structures it trusted. At home, Monique poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to her husband. They sat together in the quiet of their living room, the weight of the last months slowly lifting. "You carried it further than anyone thought possible," she said softly. Terrence's eyes met hers. "I carried it because I had to, but I didn't carry it alone." She smiled faintly. "No, you didn't. And you never will." The knock at the door startled them both. When Terrence opened it, he found Danielle Morgan, the TSA supervisor, standing with a folder in her hands. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Not as a supervisor, not as an official. As a citizen. What you did gave people like me the courage to speak." To step out of silence, Terrence accepted the folder, nodding slowly. "Courage doesn't come from me, it comes from truth. You spoke it when it mattered." Danielle smiled faintly, then left, her presence a reminder that change begins with individuals willing to act. In the weeks that followed, the nation moved forward, but the memory of the airport confrontation lingered. It became a case study in law schools, a topic of debate in classrooms, a reference point in training sessions for officers. It was replayed not as scandal, but as lesson. For Jason Whitaker, the lesson was harsher. From the window of his cell, he saw only concrete walls and the dim light of regret. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The words he had spoken, the arrogance in his tone, the silence of the man he had underestimated, and each time the same truth crushed him. He had thought himself powerful, but his own weakness had been laid bare. For Terrence Harris, the lesson was different. Standing one morning at the steps of the Capitol, he addressed a crowd of reporters and citizens gathered to hear him speak. His voice was calm but resolute. "What began in an airport terminal was never just about me. It was about every American who has been made to feel less than equal. About every traveler who has been stopped without reason, about every person who has been told they don't belong. We cannot erase the past, but we can shape the future. And that future must be one of accountability, dignity, and justice." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing against the marble columns. Cameras broadcast his words across the nation, cementing them into history. Later that evening, as the city settled into silence, Terrence sat with Monique on their porch. The night air was cool, the sky scattered with stars. "Do you ever wonder," Monique asked quietly, "what would have happened if that officer had known who you were from the start?" Terrence considered the question, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "If he had known, he might have treated me differently." "But that's the point. He shouldn't have to know. No one should need a title or a position to be treated with dignity." Monique leaned against him, her voice soft. "Then maybe that's the real legacy. Not the bill, not the headlines, but that truth." Terrence nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. "Yes, that truth." And with that, the story that began with a single confrontation in an airport closed not with vengeance, but with resolve. Jason Whitaker's downfall was a warning. Terrence Harris's stand was a beacon. And together, they reminded a nation that justice is not measured in power, but in the dignity of how we treat one another.